Central Pacific, mid-1943. The sky above the scattered islands was wide and painfully clear, the kind of blue Japanese naval aviators had once welcomed with confidence. Sunlight glinted off wings as a flight of Zero fighters cruised at altitude, engines humming with familiar precision. For years, this sky had belonged to them. Speed, agility, and experience had given Japanese pilots an edge they trusted without question. Then, the silhouettes appeared. American fighters climbed toward them, not cautiously, not tentatively, but with deliberate purpose. They did not turn when the Zeros angled in. They did not bleed speed in tight circles. Instead, they held formation, diving and climbing with an energy Japanese pilots had not expected. The first exchange lasted seconds. Bursts of fire. A Zero fell away, trailing smoke. Another followed. The Americans regrouped smoothly, climbing back into position as if rehearsed. This was not the enemy they remembered from 1942. Inside Japanese cockpits, disbelief replaced instinct. Controls felt suddenly less forgiving. Familiar maneuvers no longer guaranteed escape. The sky, once an ally, had turned uncertain. After landing, pilots spoke quietly, not in anger, not in panic, in confusion. Something had changed. America had learned, and in learning, it had not merely countered the Zero. It had created something far more dangerous. That realization marked the beginning of the end for an era of air combat Japan had once dominated, and it forced every pilot to confront a truth that could not be unlearned. In the opening months of the Pacific War, Japanese naval aviation appeared untouchable. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from the Dutch East Indies to the skies over the Indian Ocean, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero carved a reputation that spread faster than intelligence reports could keep up. Allied pilots learned quickly and painfully that the Zero was not just another fighter. It was something fundamentally different. The Zero had been designed with a singular purpose: to dominate air combat through range and maneuverability. Japanese engineers stripped weight wherever possible. Armor was sacrificed. Self-sealing fuel tanks were omitted. In exchange, the aircraft gained extraordinary agility and endurance. It could turn tighter than anything the Allies fielded in 1941. It could fly farther, and it was placed in the hands of pilots trained through an unforgiving system that selected for exceptional skill. Japanese naval aviators entered the war as elite professionals. Training pipelines before 1941 were long, selective, and brutal. Only a small percentage of candidates survived to earn their wings. Those who did accumulated hundreds of flight hours before combat, far more than most Allied pilots at the time. They were taught to fight offensively, decisively, and with confidence in their aircraft. Early American encounters with the Zero reinforced Japanese belief in their superiority. U.S. Navy and Marine pilots flying Wildcats found themselves outturned and outclimbed. Standard dogfighting instincts proved lethal, losses mounted. Reports from the front described an enemy fighter that seemed to defy the known limits of air combat. For Japanese pilots, these victories confirmed long-held assumptions. They believed their combination of aircraft design and pilot skill had created a permanent advantage. The Zero was not merely better, it was emblematic of a system that worked. Japanese command shared this confidence. Early successes encouraged the belief that American industrial power would take too long to translate into effective air superiority. This assumption would prove decisive. The first cracks appeared not in combat, but in analysis. American pilots who survived early encounters began reporting patterns. The Zero could outturn anything, but it paid a price for that agility. It bled energy in vertical maneuvers. It lacked protection. When hit, it burned easily. These observations were fragmentary at first, buried beneath casualty lists and urgent operational demands. Then came a turning point that would quietly reshape the air war. In June 1942, during the Aleutian Islands campaign, a Japanese Zero made a forced landing on Akutan Island after sustaining damage. The aircraft was recovered largely intact by American forces. For the first time, the Zero could be studied not through wreckage, but as a functioning machine. The implications were profound. American engineers and test pilots examined the aircraft in detail. They measured its performance envelope. They pushed it through turns, climbs, and dives. They confirmed what combat pilots had suspected. The Zero excelled at low-speed maneuvering, but struggled in high-speed dives. Its controls stiffened at speed. It lacked armor and self-sealing tanks. It was lethal in a turning fight, but vulnerable everywhere else. This knowledge did not produce an immediate miracle. It produced doctrine. American commanders understood that they did not need to outturn the Zero. They needed to refuse its terms of engagement. New tactics emphasized speed, altitude, and teamwork. The thatch weave, a defensive maneuver developed even before the Zero was fully understood, became standard practice. Pilots were trained to fight as coordinated pairs, covering one another rather than relying on individual skill.
At the same time, American aircraft design began to reflect these lessons. Engineers were not asked to copy the Zero, they were asked to defeat it. The result was a new generation of fighters that traded tight turning circles for survivability, firepower, and performance at speed. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Vought F-4U Corsair emerged as embodiments of this shift. Heavier, faster, more robust, designed to absorb punishment and keep flying. Equally important was the system behind them. American pilot training expanded dramatically. While individual flight hours were often fewer than those of pre-war Japanese aviators, training was standardized, scalable, and continuously refined. Lessons from combat were fed back into syllabi at a pace Japan could not match. Replacement pilots arrived consistently. Aircraft arrived in overwhelming numbers. Japanese aviation, by contrast, began to strain under attrition. The elite pilots who had carried the early war were irreplaceable at scale. Training programs shortened, standards slipped, aircraft production struggled to keep pace with losses. The Zero remained dangerous, but the environment that had once amplified its strengths was eroding. By 1943, Japanese pilots were encountering an enemy that no longer played by familiar rules. American fighters did not chase turns. They attacked from above, disengaged at will, and returned with numbers that seemed endless. Battles that once favored Japanese tactics now punished them. This shift was not immediately acknowledged by Japanese command. Reports were filtered. Losses were explained as local setbacks. Faith in the Zero lingered, but among pilots the realization spread quickly. America had learned. They had studied the Zero, understood it, and built a response that did not imitate but surpassed. What stunned Japanese aviators was not that America adapted, it was how completely the adaptation changed the nature of the fight. The Zero had not been matched on its own terms. It had been rendered obsolete by a system that refused to engage where it was strongest. By the time this truth became undeniable, the balance of air power in the Pacific was already shifting, and the skies that had once belonged to Japan were becoming contested, then hostile. That realization set the stage for the moments when shock turned into acceptance, when Japanese pilots faced the full consequence of an enemy that had not only countered the Zero, but created something far more dangerous. Human angle. Inside the Japanese cockpit as certainty faded. For Japanese naval aviators, the Zero was never just an aircraft, it was trust made tangible. Every movement of the control stick, every turn at the edge of a stall, reinforced a belief that skill and machine were perfectly matched. Early victories had not merely boosted morale, they had shaped identity. Pilots believed they belonged to an elite brotherhood whose mastery of the air was unquestioned. That belief began to fracture in subtle ways. By mid-1943, pilots returning from combat no longer spoke with the same certainty. Debriefs included unfamiliar phrases. They didn't turn, they climbed away, they came back together. These were not excuses, they were observations. Japanese pilots were encountering Americans who refused to fight the way the Zero demanded. What unsettled them most was not defeat itself, but predictability. Once Zero pilots could anticipate enemy reactions, now they faced opponents who disengaged at will, re-entered from altitude, and coordinated attacks with discipline that felt deliberate rather than instinctive. In the cockpit, this change was physical. Controls that once promised escape now led only to vulnerability. A tight turn exposed the Zero's lack of armor. A moment too long in a climb invited diving attacks that could not be countered. Pilots learned, often too late, that familiar instincts no longer worked. Among veterans, the realization carried emotional weight. Years of training had been built around mastering a specific form of combat. When that form was denied, experience became less valuable overnight. Younger pilots sensed the shift even more sharply. They were entering combat without the margin of superiority their predecessors had enjoyed. After landing, conversations changed tone. Confidence gave way to analysis. Pilots spoke quietly, comparing encounters, searching for patterns. What emerged was a shared understanding. America had not simply built a better airplane, it had changed the rules of engagement. That realization struck at the core of Japanese air power because it suggested something deeper than technological competition. It suggested that mastery itself was temporary. Technological angle. Why the Zero's strengths became liabilities. From a technical standpoint, the Zero had always been a calculated gamble. Its designers chose maneuverability and range over protection and durability. Early in the war, this gamble paid off spectacularly. Against opponents who accepted turning fights, the Zero was lethal. But technology exists within context. As American pilots learned to exploit the Zero's weaknesses, its defining strengths became liabilities. The lack of armor meant that even brief hits could be catastrophic. The absence of self-sealing fuel tanks turned damage into fire. High-speed dives stressed airframes and stiffened controls, limiting escape options. American engineers understood these trade-offs clearly after testing captured aircraft. They did not view the Zero as flawed, it was optimized for a specific vision of air combat. The problem for Japan was that this vision could be denied. New American fighters embodied a different philosophy. Survivability mattered, speed mattered, energy retention mattered. Aircraft like the Hellcat and Corsair could absorb punishment and remain operational. They allowed pilots to make mistakes and survive them, an advantage that compounded over time. Equally important was firepower that shifted the balance. Heavier armament reduced the need for prolonged engagement. Short firing windows became decisive. Against such attacks, the Zero's agility offered little protection. From the Japanese perspective, this change felt unfair, not because it violated rules, but because it exposed the fragility of assumptions. The Zero had not become obsolete overnight, it had become situational, and situations were increasingly shaped by the enemy. Enemy perspective angle. How America turned learning into dominance. What shocked Japanese aviators most was not American innovation, but American learning speed. Early in the war, U.S. pilots made costly mistakes. They paid for them in aircraft and lives, but those mistakes were not repeated endlessly. Lessons were gathered, analyzed, and disseminated across the force with industrial efficiency. Doctrine evolved faster than Japanese intelligence could track. Training manuals were updated. Combat tactics were standardized. Pilots arriving at the front already knew what not to do against the Zero. This process extended beyond tactics. Aircraft design responded directly to combat feedback. Production pipelines adjusted. Training emphasized teamwork over individual heroism. Losses were absorbed without degrading overall effectiveness. From the Japanese perspective, this adaptation was deeply unsettling. Their own system prized elite skill developed over time. America's system produced competence at scale. One relied on excellence, the other on resilience. By 1943, Japanese pilots were no longer fighting isolated squadrons. They were fighting a learning machine. Each engagement reinforced this perception. American formations grew tighter. Attacks became more coordinated. Mistakes diminished. Survivability increased. The enemy did not need to win every fight. It needed only to improve faster than Japan could replace experience.
This realization spread through the ranks quietly but decisively. Japanese pilots began to understand that the Zero had been countered not by imitation, but by transformation. And as this understanding deepened, the air war approached its turning point, when adaptation became dominance and shock gave way to inevitability. Tactical angle, when the sky stopped belonging to the Zero. The most decisive shift in the Pacific Air War was not marked by a single aircraft introduction or battle date. It was marked by a change in behavior. Japanese pilots began encountering American fighters that refused to stay where the Zero was strongest. Early war combat had followed a familiar rhythm. Engagements collapsed into turning fights. Individual skill decided outcomes. The Zero thrived in this environment. But by mid-1943, American tactics had evolved into something colder and more disciplined. The thatch weave, once an emergency defensive concept, became standard practice. American pilots flew in pairs and sections, covering one another constantly. Any Zero attempting to exploit maneuverability found itself exposed to another aircraft already positioned to fire. The sky became layered with threat. Vertical tactics replaced horizontal contests. American fighters dove from altitude, fired briefly, and climbed away. They disengaged without shame. They returned with advantage intact. Japanese pilots discovered that chasing only led to vulnerability. Staying defensive only delayed the inevitable. What made this shift devastating was consistency. These tactics were not improvised. They were taught, rehearsed, and reinforced. Every American pilot arriving in theater understood the same rules of engagement. The Zero's advantage depended on forcing a certain kind of fight. America simply refused to provide it. By the time Japanese pilots adjusted their expectations, the tactical environment had already changed irreversibly. The sky was no longer a contest of individual brilliance. It had become a controlled space governed by teamwork, altitude, and energy management. And in that space, the Zero could survive, but it could no longer dominate. Leadership angle. Commanders facing a vanishing advantage. Japanese air leadership struggled to respond to this transformation. Early victories had reinforced confidence in existing doctrine. The Zero had been validated by success, making doctrinal change difficult to justify within the hierarchy. Reports from pilots describing new American tactics were initially treated as anomalies. Losses were attributed to local conditions, weather, or numerical disadvantage. The idea that the Zero itself was becoming outmatched conflicted with deeply held beliefs about Japanese aviation superiority. This hesitation had consequences. While American command rapidly adjusted training and deployment based on battlefield feedback, Japanese leadership remained anchored to pre-war assumptions. Efforts to improve aircraft performance focused on incremental changes rather than systemic overhaul. New designs arrived slowly and in limited numbers. Training pipelines struggled to maintain quality as losses mounted. Perhaps most damaging was the inability to replace experience. The elite pilots who had defined early war success were irreplaceable. As they fell, the knowledge they carried vanished with them. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours and less confidence, facing an enemy that was growing stronger rather than weaker. Leadership decisions reflected this strain. Risk tolerance increased. Missions were flown that offered little chance of success. Defensive postures replaced aggressive patrols. The Zero, once a summit of initiative, became a tool of necessity rather than choice. For pilots in the air, these shifts were unmistakable. Orders changed tone, expectations lowered. The confidence that had once flown from command eroded, replaced by quiet acknowledgement that the balance had shifted. Psychological angle, from shock to acceptance. The most profound change occurred not in aircraft performance or tactics, but in mindset. Japanese pilots entered the war believing air superiority was their birthright. It had been earned through training, sacrifice, and early success. Losing that superiority did not immediately produce fear, it produced disbelief. That disbelief faded quickly. Repeated encounters with American fighters that could not be outturned, outrun, or intimidated forced pilots to reassess everything they thought they knew. Familiar maneuvers no longer guaranteed survival. Aggression became risk. Confidence became exposure. Psychological pressure mounted as losses accumulated. Pilots became cautious where they had once been bold. Engagement shortened. Situational awareness narrowed. The sky felt crowded and hostile in ways it never had before. American pilots, by contrast, grew more confident with each engagement. Survivability bred experience. Experience bred composure. Composure bred dominance. The psychological momentum shifted decisively. By late 1943, Japanese pilots were no longer stunned by American adaptation. They expected it. The shock had passed. What remained was acceptance. Acceptance that the Zero had been solved. Acceptance that America's strength lay not in copying, but in learning. Acceptance that the air war was now being fought on terms Japan could not control. This acceptance did not end resistance. Pilots continued to fight with skill and courage, but they did so knowing the outcome of most engagements before they began. That knowledge carried a weight heavier than fear, and it set the stage for the climactic moment of the Pacific Air War,
when the combination of tactics, production, and doctrine converged into a force that Japanese pilots could neither outfly nor outlast. The moment the Zero was no longer enough. By the middle of 1943, Japanese pilots were no longer guessing that something had changed. They were encountering it repeatedly in battle after battle across a widening front. The Pacific Air War had entered a new phase, one defined not by isolated encounters, but by patterns that could no longer be ignored. The Solomon Islands became one of the clearest proving grounds. In earlier campaigns, Japanese air units had dictated the tempo. They chose when to engage, how long to fight, and when to disengage. American fighters reacted. Now the roles were reversing. American patrols arrived at altitude. They attacked in coordinated groups. They disengaged deliberately, conserving energy and formation integrity. Japanese pilots found themselves reacting instead of controlling. The first encounters with the F-66 Hellcat were especially disorienting. From a distance, it did not appear remarkable. It was larger than the Zero, heavier, less graceful in a turn. But once combat began, its purpose became clear. The Hellcat absorbed punishment that would have destroyed a Zero outright. It dove faster, it climbed with authority when given room, and it carried firepower that reduced firing windows to seconds. Japanese pilots attempted to apply familiar solutions. They tightened turns, they sought close-in fights, they tried to force the Hellcat into the horizontal plane. Sometimes this worked, briefly, but increasingly the American pilots refused the invitation. They broke away, climbed, and returned with advantage restored. This refusal was decisive. In engagements over the Solomons, Japanese pilots began reporting something unprecedented. The enemy was dictating the terms of combat. Attacks came from above, not below. Engagements ended when the Americans chose, not when fuel or ammunition ran low. The Zero's defining strength, control through maneuver, was being denied systematically. Statistical patterns soon followed. Combat reports from mid to late 1943 showed a steady shift in loss ratios. Where Japanese pilots had once expected favorable outcomes even against numerical disadvantage, they now faced mounting losses against equal or smaller American formations. Survivors noted that American aircraft returned repeatedly to the fight, while damaged Zeros rarely did. The psychological effect was immediate. Pilots began entering combat already calculating escape routes rather than attack vectors. They conserved ammunition. They avoided prolonged engagement. These were rational responses, but they marked a fundamental change. The Zero was no longer a tool of dominance. It was a means of survival. American command recognized the moment with clarity. By late 1943, U.S. naval aviation doctrine had fully embraced energy fighting as standard practice. Training emphasized altitude control, mutual support, and disciplined disengagement. Pilots were instructed explicitly on what not to do against the Zero. The goal was not to defeat Japanese pilots through superior skill, but to deny them opportunities to exploit their own. Aircraft production amplified this shift. The Hellcat arrived not in handfuls, but in squadrons. Replacement pilots arrived continuously, trained in the same doctrine, flying the same aircraft, supported by the same logistics. Losses were absorbed, experience accumulated. Tactical refinement continued without interruption. Japanese aviation could not match this cycle. Aircraft production struggled. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours and less preparation. Veteran pilots carried increasing responsibility, flying more missions under worsening conditions. The Zero, though still capable, now faced opponents designed to exploit its vulnerabilities relentlessly. One battle after another reinforced the same lesson. In engagements over the Central Pacific, Japanese pilots encountered American fighters that behaved with almost mechanical consistency. They attacked, disengaged, regrouped, and attacked again. Individual heroism no longer disrupted formations. Surprise diminished. The airspace felt controlled rather than contested. This was the true turning point. Not a single dogfight, not a single aircraft model, but the moment when Japanese pilots realized they were fighting a system, not individuals. Reports from Japanese units began to reflect this understanding. Language shifted, confidence softened. Descriptions became analytical rather than celebratory. Pilots word of enemies who did not accept combat, who withdrew upward, who returned in coordination. These were not complaints, they were acknowledgments. By the end of 1943, Japanese pilots' quiet reputation had changed even among those who flew it. It was still respected, still trusted in specific conditions, but it was no longer feared by the enemy, and that realization carried heavy meaning. For Japanese pilots, the shock lay not in defeat, but in recognition. America had not beaten the Zero by building its equal. It had beaten it by changing the entire geometry of air combat. And once that geometry shifted, there was no path back. The Zero could still fight, but it could no longer decide. That understanding marked the beginning of inevitability, setting the stage for the climactic moment of the Pacific Air War, when the combination of tactics, production, and doctrine converged into a force that Japanese pilots could neither outfly nor outlast. When adaptation became overwhelming superiority. By early 1944, the shift that Japanese pilots had sensed was no longer subtle. It had hardened into reality. The Pacific Air War was no longer balanced on tactics alone. It had become a contest between two systems, one accelerating, the other eroding. The arrival of massed American carrier air power marked the moment when adaptation crossed into dominance. In operations across the Central Pacific, Japanese pilots encountered American fighter groups operating with unprecedented coordination. Hellcats filled the sky in numbers that dwarfed earlier engagements. They launched, formed, climbed, and patrolled with efficiency that left little room for surprise. Where the Zero had once thrived on isolated encounters, it now faced layered defenses that denied entry before combat even began.
Japanese pilots reported a new pattern. American fighters appeared early. They arrived high. They attacked first. Engagements began with disadvantage already imposed.
Attempts to regain initiative failed repeatedly. Zeros climbed aggressively, only to find themselves met by fighters that retained energy and altitude. Diving attacks were met with concentrated fire. Breaking away invited pursuit by fresh aircraft rotating into position. The Americans were not just fighting, they were managing the battle space. Statistical reality followed quickly. Loss ratios shifted decisively in American favor. In engagements where Japanese pilots once expected parity or advantage, they now faced attrition they could not sustain. Aircraft lost were not replaced at the same rate. Pilots lost could not be replaced at all. The cumulative effect was devastating. Japanese command recognized the problem, but solutions arrived too late. New aircraft designs promised improvements, but reached units in limited numbers. Training programs shortened further, sending inexperienced pilots into combat against veterans flying superior machines. Tactical adjustments were proposed, but implementation lagged behind the pace of American operations. For pilots in the air, the experience became one of constraint. They flew knowing where they could not go. They avoided altitude they could not hold. They disengaged sooner. Confidence narrowed into caution. The Zero's agility, once a source of freedom, now offered only brief windows of survival. American pilots, meanwhile, experienced the opposite transformation. Survivability allowed experience to accumulate. Experience refined discipline. Discipline reinforced tactics. Pilots flew with the expectation of control. They trusted their aircraft. They trusted their wingmen. They trusted the system supporting them. Losses were tragic, but they were not decisive. This psychological asymmetry mattered. Japanese pilots entered combat aware of their vulnerability. American pilots entered combat expecting advantage. That expectation shaped behavior, decision-making, and outcomes in ways no single maneuver could offset. By mid-1944, the Zero's presence no longer dictated engagements, it reacted to them. Japanese pilots knew this. Reports from the period reflect a resigned clarity. The enemy's strength was no longer questioned, it was described. Descriptions emphasized American numbers, coordination, and resilience. They noted how attacks arrived in waves, how damaged aircraft returned to carriers rather than falling from the sky, how pilots disengaged without hesitation, preserving force rather than chasing glory. This was not the air war Japanese doctrine had prepared them for. The decisive realization came not from one catastrophic defeat, but from repetition. Every engagement confirmed the same pattern. The Zero could still kill, but it could not control. And without control, superiority was impossible. For Japanese pilots, the shock of adaptation had matured into inevitability. America had not created a single Zero killer. It had created an environment in which the Zero no longer mattered as it once had. The aircraft was outpaced by production, overwhelmed by coordination, and undone by a doctrine that refused to fight on its terms. This was the moment the war in the air was effectively decided. Not because Japanese pilots stopped fighting, not because the Zero vanished from the sky, but because the balance of power had shifted beyond recovery. The Americans had learned faster. They had produced relentlessly. They had integrated lessons at scale. And in doing so, they had transformed the Zero from symbol of dominance into relic of an earlier phase of the war. What followed would be grim and costly, but it would not change the trajectory set in motion by this turning point. The consequences of American adaptation would ripple outward, shaping losses, strategy, and psychology across the remaining months of the conflict. Those consequences would become fully visible in the aftermath, as Japanese aviation confronted a future it could no longer influence from the sky. What the loss of air superiority cost Japan. By the time the Pacific War entered its final year, the consequences of losing air superiority were no longer theoretical. They were measurable, visible, and irreversible. Japanese aviation did not collapse in a single moment, but it was steadily hollowed out, by attrition, by exhaustion, and by the realization that control of the sky had passed permanently to the enemy. For Japanese pilots, the aftermath of Americans' adaptation was lived daily. Missions grew more dangerous. Survival windows shrank. Every sortie carried the awareness that American fighters would likely be waiting above, unseen until they struck. Where earlier in the war pilots had worried about fuel and navigation, they now worry first about interception. The Zero remained in service, but its role changed dramatically. It was no longer the spearhead of Japanese operations. It became a defensive tool, used to contest airspace briefly, delay American strikes, or escort missions that were already compromised by American presence. Losses mounted quickly. Japanese aircraft production could not keep pace with destruction.
More critically, pilot losses could not be replaced in kind. The pre-war training system that had produced elite aviators had been dismantled by necessity. Flight hours were reduced, standards lowered. Young pilots arrived at the front with limited experience, facing enemies who were not only better equipped, but better prepared. This imbalance had cascading effects. Inexperienced pilots struggled to survive long enough to gain combat experience. Veteran pilots were stretched thin, flying repeated missions under increasing strain. Fatigue became constant. Mistakes multiplied. Even skilled aviators found themselves overwhelmed by numbers and coordination rather than individual skill. Japanese command attempted adjustments. New tactics were issued. Emphasis shifted towards interception and defense. But without air superiority, these changes amounted to damage control rather than recovery. American air power now shaped every major operation. Carrier task forces moved with confidence, protected by layered fighter screens. Amphibious landings proceeded under near constant air cover. Japanese naval and ground units faced relentless attack from the air, often before they could engage enemy forces directly. For Japanese forces on the ground, the loss of air cover was devastating. Supply lines were exposed. Troop movements were detected and attacked. Defensive positions were softened from above before contact was made. Morale suffered as soldiers realized the enemy could strike at will. This was the true cost of losing control of the air. The Zero's early dominance had allowed Japan to project power across vast distances. Its decline stripped that capability away. The aircraft itself did not fail. Its context did. Without numerical parity, without pilot depth, without industrial backing, even the most elegant design could not alter outcomes. American pilots understood this advantage clearly. They flew knowing reinforcements would arrive. They knew damaged aircraft could be repaired or replaced. They knew lessons learned in one battle would shape training before the next. This confidence translated into aggression tempered by discipline. Japanese pilots flew knowing each loss mattered disproportionately. That knowledge weighed heavily. It altered risk calculation. It narrowed tactical options. It turned initiative into caution. By late 1944, the psychological divide between the two air forces was complete. American pilots expected success. Japanese pilots hoped for survival. This difference shaped engagement outcomes as much as aircraft performance. The Zero, once a source of mastery, became a reminder of what had been lost. Pilots still respected its agility. They still trusted it in moments of necessity. But they no longer believed it could decide battles. That belief, once shattered, never returned. As American operations expanded towards the Philippines and beyond, Japanese aviation found itself reacting continuously, unable to seize or hold initiative. Even successful engagements failed to alter strategic momentum. The air war had become asymmetrical. One side accumulated strength. The other expended it. This imbalance carried through every remaining campaign. Japanese pilots continued to fight with courage and professionalism. But courage could not compensate for systemic disadvantage. The skies no longer belonged to them. And without the sky, the broader war narrowed towards a single direction. The aftermath of America countering the Zero was not just a change in aircraft dominance. It was the collapse of a strategic foundation. Japan's ability to project power, protect its forces, and shape the battlefield from above had been fundamentally broken. What remained was adaptation of a different kind. One driven by desperation rather than innovation. And as the war progressed, Japanese aviation would confront not just technological inferiority, but the emotional burden of knowing that the turning point had already passed. That realization would deepen in the final phase of the conflict, when reflection replaced shock, and acceptance followed loss, marking the last chapter in the Zero's long journey from dominance to obsolescence. Acceptance, adaptation, and the end of an era. As the Pacific War moved into its final, brutal phase, Japanese aviation entered a period defined less by shock than by resignation. The transformation that had stunned pilots in 1943 had become a permanent condition by 1944. American air power was no longer an emerging threat. It was the environment in which all Japanese operations now existed. For Japanese pilots, this shift forced a painful reassessment of identity. The Zero had once symbolized more than technical excellence. It represented a belief system that superior training, spirit, and maneuverability could overcome material disadvantage. Early victories had validated that belief so completely that questioning it felt unnecessary. By the war's final year, that certainty had eroded beyond repair. Combat reports from late 1944 and early 1945 reveal a striking change in tone. Where earlier accounts emphasized tactics and skill, later reports focused on numbers, altitude disadvantage, and lack of opportunity. Pilots wrote not about how to defeat the enemy, but about how to avoid annihilation long enough to complete missions. This was not cowardice. It was realism. Japanese aviation had entered a phase where survival itself required adaptation. Pilots altered flight profiles. Engagements were shortened or avoided entirely. Missions were flown at low altitude to reduce exposure, despite increased risk from ground fire. Every decision was shaped by awareness of American control of the air. Japanese command faced impossible choices. Aircraft production continued, but the gap widened relentlessly. New designs promised improvements in speed or firepower, yet they arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. Even when technically capable aircraft reached frontline units, they were flown by pilots with limited training, facing enemies who were not only better equipped, but better prepared. This imbalance had cascading effects. Inexperienced pilots struggled to survive long enough to gain combat experience.
During operations in the Philippines, Japanese air units attempted to contest American advances, but were overwhelmed quickly. Carrier-based American fighters established air dominance early, denying Japanese forces the ability to maneuver or resupply effectively. Losses mounted at rates Japanese command could no longer rationalize or replace. By this stage, Japanese pilots fully understood what had happened. The Zero had not failed because it was poorly designed. It had failed because the conditions that once made it dominant no longer existed. American adaptation had removed those conditions systematically. The air war was no longer a contest of aircraft, it was a contest of systems, and Japan had lost that contest. This understanding filtered down through squadrons quietly. There were no dramatic announcements, no official declarations of obsolescence. Instead, pilots adjusted expectations internally. They flew knowing the odds. They accepted missions knowing survival was unlikely. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots carried the burden of fighting in a war whose trajectory they could no longer influence. They understood that even successful engagements would not change strategic reality. Air superiority was gone, and with it the ability to shape events rather than react to them. American air power now operated with near impunity. Strategic bombing intensified, naval forces moved freely, amphibious assaults proceeded under overwhelming air cover. Japanese ground and naval units faced constant observation and attack from above. The Zero's presence in these final months became symbolic. It remained agile, it remained familiar, but it no longer inspired confidence, neither in its pilots nor in those who faced it. American pilots respected it as a historical threat, not a current one. They engaged methodically, confident in doctrine and support. Post-war Japanese reflections acknowledged this transformation with clarity. Veterans did not describe being defeated by a single aircraft or tactic. They described being outpaced, intellectually, industrially, and organizationally. America's ability to learn, produce, and adapt at scale had proven decisive. This recognition stripped the Zero of its myth without diminishing the courage of those who flew it. The aircraft had been a masterpiece of its moment. It had reshaped air combat early in the war, but war did not pause, and Japan's inability to evolve its system as rapidly as its enemy sealed the Zero's fate. By the time the war ended, Japanese pilots understood the arc of their experience fully. They had entered the conflict believing air superiority was assured by excellence. They ended it knowing that excellence without adaptation and scale could not endure. The aftermath of America countering the Zero was not just a tactical defeat, it was the collapse of a worldview. And in that collapse lay one of the most enduring lessons of modern warfare. Dominance is temporary, and survival belongs not to those who perfect a weapon, but to those who never stop learning how to fight with it. What the Zero's fall revealed about modern war. When the Pacific War finally ended, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero remained one of the most recognizable aircraft of the conflict. Its silhouette was unmistakable. Its early victories were legendary. Yet among Japanese pilots and American analysts alike, the Zero's legacy was no longer defined by dominance. It was defined by transition, by what happens when a weapon that once shaped the battlefield is overtaken by a system that learns faster than it does. The Zero had been brilliant at what it was designed to do. It embodied a philosophy of air combat rooted in pre-war assumptions, that maneuverability, range, and pilot skill could overcome material disparity. In the opening phase of the war, that philosophy worked. It worked so well that it seemed self-evident, even permanent. Japanese pilots did not simply fly the Zero, they trusted it as proof that their way of war was correct. That trust, however, depended on context. The Zero's success required opponents who fought on its terms. It required pilots willing to turn, to chase, to engage in contests of individual skill. It required a tempo of war where experience accumulated slowly and losses were manageable. Once those conditions disappeared, the Zero's advantages narrowed rapidly. What American forces demonstrated was not a superior aircraft in isolation, but a superior process.
They showed that dominance in war is not achieved by perfecting a single tool, but by building an ecosystem capable of absorbing failure, extracting lessons, and applying them at scale. This distinction matters. American pilots were not initially better than their Japanese counterparts. In many early engagements, they were clearly outmatched. But those losses were not accepted as fate. They became data. Each engagement produced analysis. Each mistake generated a corrective response. Tactics evolved, training changed, aircraft design followed doctrine rather than tradition. The capture and testing of the Zero symbolized this process perfectly. America did not respond by trying to become Japan. It responded by understanding Japan and then refusing to fight where Japan was strongest. This refusal was not cowardice, it was discipline. Japanese aviation, by contrast, struggled to adapt its underlying assumptions. The Zero's early success reinforced belief in existing doctrine rather than challenging it. Adjustments were made, but they were incremental. Structural change came too slowly. By the time new aircraft and revised tactics reached frontline units, the environment had already shifted. This imbalance exposed a deeper truth about modern warfare. War in the industrial age is not a contest of singular excellence. It is a contest of learning curves. The side that shortens its learning cycle gains an advantage that compounds over time. Aircraft, tanks, ships, and weapons all matter, but only insofar as they are embedded in a system capable of evolving. For Japanese pilots, this realization arrived gradually and painfully. They did not lose confidence in their own skill. They lost confidence in the framework that once amplified that skill. They discovered that mastery of a specific form of combat could become a liability when the enemy simply declined to participate in it. The psychological impact of this discovery cannot be overstated. Pilots who had trained for years to perfect a particular style of air combat found that style rendered irrelevant. Familiar instincts became dangerous. Aggression invited destruction. Survival required restraint rather than dominance. This inversion struck at the heart of professional identity. Yet even in defeat, Japanese aviators demonstrated clarity. Post-war reflections do not dwell on bitterness toward American pilots or aircraft. Instead, they emphasize recognition. Recognition that the war had changed faster than their system could. Recognition that the Zero, for all its elegance, had been bound too tightly to a single vision of combat. Recognition that courage and skill, without adaptation and scale, could not prevail. American pilots reached a complementary understanding from the opposite direction. They learned that technological advantage alone is insufficient without doctrine and discipline. The Hellcat and Corsair were not invincible by design. They were effective because they were flown within a framework that emphasized teamwork, survivability, and continuous improvement. Pilots were encouraged to disengage, to live to fight again, to preserve force rather than chase individual victories. This mindset created resilience. Losses were absorbed, experience accumulated, confidence grew not from myth but from repetition. Over time, American pilots came to expect success, not because they believed themselves superior, but because they trusted the system that supported them. The Zero's decline thus offers a lesson that extends beyond aviation. History often celebrates innovation as a moment, a breakthrough design, a revolutionary weapon, a single brilliant idea. The Pacific Air War reveals a different reality. Innovation is a process. It is sustained by institutions willing to question themselves, accept loss, and adapt continuously. The Zero was innovative. It reshaped air combat in 1941 and 1942, but innovation that does not evolve becomes stagnation. When the enemy learns, adapts, and changes the rules, yesterday's solution becomes today's constraint. This is why the Zero story endures, not as a cautionary tale about flawed design, but as a reminder that no weapon exists outside its environment. Aircraft reflect doctrine. Doctrine reflects culture. Culture determines how quickly lessons are accepted or resisted. Japanese pilots were stunned when America countered the Zero because they expected imitation. They expected America to chase maneuverability, to build lighter fighters, to fight the same war better. Instead, America chose a different war entirely. That choice reshaped the skies. By the time the war ended, the Zero was no longer feared, not because it lacked capability, but because its moment had passed. It belonged to an earlier phase of conflict, when air combat rewarded different virtues. The world had moved on, and the aircraft had not been allowed to evolve fast enough to follow. The final lesson of the Zero is therefore not about defeat, but about impermanence. Dominance in war is temporary. Advantage erodes. Systems that adapt endure. Those that cling to past success fade, no matter how brilliant that success once was. In that sense, the Zero did not fail. It taught. It taught that mastery must be renewed constantly, that enemies are not static, that learning faster than the opponent matters more than perfecting a single tool. And it taught that in modern warfare, victory belongs not to those who build the best weapon first, but to those who never stop asking how the fight itself is changing. That is why Japanese pilots were stunned, not because America built something worse than the Zero, but because America built a way of war the Zero could no longer survive.